The Adeptus Mechanicus are a rare, if not unique entity within the Imperium of Man. They stand as one of the only organisations that was not cleansed and forcibly subjugated by the Emperor pre or post Great Crusade. In fact, without the Mechanicus, it's unlikely the Crusade would have even been possible. But what is the beginning, the middle, and the end of the Mechanicus story? What role does it play in the machinery of the galaxy-spanning Imperium of Man? In an age where so much has been lost, the Tech Priests maintain many essential items, including the powerful plasma reactors to the Golden Throne of Terror. They preserve knowledge from ages and tentatively explore science for the future. Now, unusually before we get into this, I need to clarify some definitions. Some of these may not make full sense until later explained or in context, but it's worth having a rough understanding. Also, these are often the pieces that are most commonly referred to incorrectly or mistakenly conflated, where they cannot be conflated. Even some official products ridiculously get some of these details quite regularly wrong. And I know that I'm not foolproof and that I don't often get everything right when it comes to the lore, because it's pretty complicated stuff most of the time, but seriously, a lot of this is pretty straightforward. Firstly, the Mechanicum and Adeptus Mechanicus both refer to the overall banner of the forces of Mars. It then more specifically breaks down its forces under that banner. The religion itself is a separate thing, but still comes within the banner of both of those, depending on what time period you're in. So these organizational terms of Mechanicum and Mechanicus refer to the title during either the founding period of around M25 through to the end of the Horus Heresy in M31. During the period of heresy, the Mechanicum would then split between the two sides of loyalist and heretic. This is why post-heresy, the Mechanicum would be forwardly known as the Adeptus Mechanicus. It's pretty simple, right? Mechanicum is pre-heresy, Adeptus Mechanicus is post-heresy. That's it. Really not that difficult to understand, but this error is the most commonly made. Then we have the term Cult Mechanicus, and this simply refers to the disciples of the Machine God. It is the religion of the Mechanicum and later Adeptus Mechanicus, but it doesn't change. It's also referred to as the Cult of the Machine. Now, one thing that I have not to my own satisfaction been able to define is this. Was the Cult Mechanicus the Cult Mechanicum? Now, if you look at established narratives, which I have done, like the Heresy Book Mechanicum, it talks of the Cult Mechanicum, but then later in the 8th edition Mechanicus Codex, under the period of Mechanicum, it talks only of the Cult Mechanicus. So did the naming of this group happen definitely as per the change from Mechanicum to Mechanicus, or did it happen more organically just by the passage of time? It's really unclear, as with many things in 40k, because sometimes the information just isn't there clear enough, stated ABC out and out, and you can rationalize, well, maybe the information was lost or destroyed or just never properly documented or whatever. Honestly, ultimately, it's actually not that important, strictly speaking, because the fundamentally important thing is that both refer to the followers of the Cult of the Machine. It does seem a fair assumption, though, that if pre-heresy the org was known as the Mechanicum, then it seems reasonable its followers would be the Cult of the Mechanicum, then later become the Cult of the Mechanicus when it changed. But again, in 8th edition Mechanicus Codex, it refers to Martians after overcoming the disaster to unite under the Cult Mechanicus. So that seems fairly established to me. But like I say, you can look at any number of varying supplements and it's all over the place. It's also easy to see why people get these things mixed up. They all sound kind of similar, and often people forget about the specific dates, and we might be talking about one time period but actually referencing the current organization, so it all gets a bit muddled up. Hopefully though, you have enough info on this to have a rough idea of what we're talking about when it comes to the Mechanicus. Like I say, fairly straightforward. Mechanicum is basically any time before the end of the Horus Heresy. Mechanicus, Adeptus Mechanicus, is usually after that point. Cult Mechanicus refers to the religion, which can be any time throughout the entire period. That's basically it. So where in time do we begin? We must first return to the time known as the Dark Age of Technology. This of course was the period from M15 to M25, where mankind's scientific and technological abilities were at the absolute highest, And some specific dates for you: M18 is known as the second dark age of technology, as warp drives were created in this time, and M22 is the third dark age of technology, as navigators were being used to make longer, faster warp jumps, and also the STC technology was now heavily being used, allowing faster and more powerful human expansion of the galaxy. Now, unsurprisingly, information about this time is very sparse and fragmented, and even more fabled now. While this was surely a golden age for mankind, it is now subsequently regarded by the Imperium and the Mechanicus as the Dark Times, because of the catastrophic impact these highly advanced technologies would ultimately unintentionally unleash upon humanity. And this is why the Imperium generally, until most recently, considers scientific experimentation, advancement and development extremely dangerous and is very skeptical about it. Because the unchecked high advancement of technology during the Dark Age of technology almost allowed for the complete and total extinction of humanity as a species. It's also why the Imperium uses human-machine hybrid servitors instead of true AI machines. So when people ask why is the Imperium so resistant to tech and new tech and research, the answer is not something as straightforward as just it never happens, but it's much more that they are extremely cautious and generally do not seek the hyper advancement that humanity once saw as the pinnacle of achievement. Also, much of what exists is already extremely powerful, and so currently just maintaining this has been good enough up until now. During the Dark Age of technology, Mars had already been long since colonized and terraformed, which was easily within the capability of humanity during this time. It had an atmosphere and a flourishing environment. It was no longer a red, dead world. In the early days of the Dark Age of tech, around M15 to 18, only sublight travel was possible, and so because of the significant distance from Earth in the early history of space exploration, it's believed that this separation allowed for Mars to develop a somewhat separate society in that it was both culturally and technologically different. This would later then be heavily exacerbated by certain events. Now, Mars also existed independently from Earth, but it was part of the interstellar government that humanity had created during the time of galactic expansion, and so Earth and Mars worked together to create the project that would send out fleet after fleet of colony ships into the galaxy. These ships, with their vast technological wealth later in the form of the very powerful STCs, along with them everything a human colony would require. This resulted in the creation of hundreds of thousands of new human colonies all across the galaxy. But then would come the Age of Strife. And the Age of Strife features multiple events. It's not simply just one thing that happened. In the early years, a major event would take place from M23 that effectively would begin the Age of Strife, known as the Cybernetic Revolt. This was where the AI creations of humanity from the Golden Age, known as the Men of Iron, would unleash horrific and world-ending devastation to such a degree that mankind would be crippled beyond repair, despite its incredibly advanced technology. And this period is often visualized incorrectly as just some kind of standard warfare. The Men of Iron utilized not only themselves as a war of machine constructs, but also devices that could destroy suns, extract entire continents from planets, and plagues of nano-machines that would ravage entire worlds. It is believed the Men of Iron were eventually destroyed not solely by humanity, but by an alliance of galactic powers. Because records are so fragmented from the Age of Strife, we can't be sure, but it is believed that it was not a sole human effort. There may have been other forces, likely non-human, involved in destroying and ending this period of war against the Men of Iron. So around the end of Millennium 24 and the beginning of 25, mankind's federation was still struggling to recover from the disastrous war against the Men of Iron. Its far-reaching impact on the previously secure and strong human colonies had now significantly weakened them. With galactic unity destroyed, as well as suffering from the inevitable wounds of war, material shortages, mass loss of life and destruction of infrastructure, humanity would now face a new problem. Warp travel was becoming increasingly difficult. These two things, the devastation caused by the war with the Men of Iron, combined with now being unable to travel easily through the warp and thereby cross the vast distances of space, the galaxy would effectively now return to a pre-Dark Age of technology state where only sublight travel was possible. This meant that all human colonies were now entirely on their own. This was obviously a catastrophic disaster. Trade and support could no longer be conducted, as the journeys would now take many generations to complete. Humanity was once again isolated as it had been millennia before, and the warp storms and the isolation they would create would last for roughly 4,000 years, and their effect on human society across the galaxy was, as we say, catastrophic. Some planets with a significantly advanced, more self-sufficient colony would survive into the future if they had the means to also defend and support themselves. Some worlds would be cut off, but with other, sometimes multiple human colonized planets within the reach of their sublight travel, and so they were able to maintain some level of trade and support for one another. It's important to consider that when a symbiotic trade relationship is set up with no means of backup, its collapse has an immediate and profound impact. And this was the case with mankind's trade system. It had grown over time to enable many planets to survive solely on imports from other rich parts of the human federation. Without this infrastructure and no way to gain outside support, disaster was inevitable. Many worlds would survive for a time somewhat unscathed depending on the resources that they required, while others would very quickly turn inwardly to the colony, with social order falling apart, families fighting between one another, and quickly discontent turning to anarchy, turning to cannibalizing anything they could lay their hands on, and the colony then consuming itself from the inside out. First often with increasing barbarism, and ultimately a pure survival of the fittest apocalypse-style situation, with survivors scavenging and killing each other over the scarce resources that remained. The final phase often led the significantly depleted population to either a total state of disorder and survivalism, or in the best case scenario, a feudal system of warlords and small communities eking out the bare bones of survival. This depressing chaos was repeated across the majority of human worlds in this period, including Earth, whose ecosystem had long since collapsed and was wholly reliant on imports as the hub center of the human trading system. And this whole situation might sound unbelievable, that backups would not be in place to prevent such an immense and speedy societal collapse, and to such a severe degree, especially for a society that was so advanced. But it's worth considering that in this time, human society had built itself up to be so strong in belief of its own invincibility, such arrogance that they could resolve any issue that came their way. They simply didn't anticipate the severity of the warp storms or how this would debilitate the trade and support systems they had been relying upon. And human history is littered with examples of such sheer arrogance outweighing logic and reason, as well as blindly staring down dangerous facts in favour of belief in our own self-importance, of not wanting to face the realization of the truth. By allowing subsequent lack of easy planning when it came to losing the infrastructure was an acute example of this human arrogance, not to mention that the Men of Iron had heavily damaged many human worlds, so even those who may have been able to survive reasonably before that were crippled so severely and in such a weakened state to withstand suddenly being deprived of resources seemed extremely unlikely. And then worse was to come, as demons from the warp would begin possessing previously undetected psykers across the worlds of humanity, and even on many worlds where psykers had already been encouraged to advance and train their abilities, they would now be exploited by the creatures of the warp, who would unleash hellish nightmares onto the already badly weakened human colonies. To compound issues, orcs then as well would sense the weakened human colonies and begin to assault them with savage mass genocide across planets that lacked the resources and defenses to withstand the wave of green ultra violence. The age of strife for humanity was nothing short of a complete and total disaster. But here is where we go sideways from the main story, because whilst the rest of humanity was literally tearing itself apart or being torn apart by Xenos, Mars itself had a different story to tell. Yet to be sure, it did not escape the anarchy, far from it. Now, the population of Mars at this time, due to the ensuing confusion and chaos caused by the Age of Strife, would end up splitting into factions and becoming preoccupied by more local and urgent matters, leaving behind their duties of care, similarly to many human colonies all across the galaxy were doing. On Mars, though, this lack of attendance to the machines and systems that subsequently enabled Mars to maintain its atmosphere fell into disrepair and ceased to function. Its radiation shields would subsequently break down, leaving its terraformed ecosystem to then be annihilated by solar radiation. Mars would once again in fairly short order become a barren red desert planet. Undoubtedly, the raging civil war didn't help matters, as the deadly weapons combined with the now unrestrained solar radiation caused, among other things, plagues that would then kill most of the civilian population. Most of the survivors who had been somehow able to survive all of this on the surface were now nightmarishly deformed mutants, gross parodies of human form, unable to speak in a recognizable language and surviving by just scavenging and cannibalizing any organic material they would find. More often than not, that organic material was other Martian colonists. This, though, was sadly not unusual for many human worlds across the galaxy during the Age of Strife, when total and complete collapse of civilization occurred for many planets that had become lazily reliant on complex trading networks to sustain them, and without this turned inwardly, tearing themselves apart in disorganized frustration and panic. The civilian chaos, environmental and social collapse, as well as the later near-total loss of the population, is where the rise of the Mechanicum and the subsequent cult of the machine begins. The minority of the population, both civilian and engineers, who were able to remain in a fairly uncompromised state, would retreat into the minimal amount of underground factories of Mars that had long produced much of the technology and machines required for humanity's previously expansionist agenda. It had been, without the title, very much still the first major forge world for mankind. The only citizens being able to survive for long periods of time, having retreated underground, would be those who were able to restore the oxygen generation systems and then to hastily forge together devices to protect themselves from the radiation storms now lashing the surface of Mars. The only ones able to do this would be the advanced engineers and technicians that would hereafter come to be known by their followers as the Tech Priests. They were the most critical of individuals for obvious reasons. They could keep the machines running that enabled survival. Marauding bands of mutants would sometimes invade and even destroy these hastily reinforced bunkers, and many early Mechanicum cultists would die in these struggles. But in doing so, these incursions would strengthen the others' survival resolve. The fact they were able to survive in the face of the apparently insurmountable odds would only continue to reinforce their desperate sense of devotion to a burgeoning cult, that of the cult of the machine, making it ever more unshakable. The early Mechanicum was quite literally a religion of survival, survival that depended on knowledge, and survival that depended on the strength of machines. As generations passed in these underground bunkers, technology was no longer taught to be understood by many, but instead to be worshipped. Quests would begin to hunt for technological artifacts, where tech priests would brave the toxic poisons and irradiated surface of the planet to search for both tech and any knowledge that could be acquired. These years represented the birth of the Mechanicum and the cult of the machine, the belief that knowledge was a manifestation of divinity. Tech priests would lead their followers to the divine trinity of the machine god, the omnisire, and the motive force, the source of all power and life in the galaxy. Incidentally, the red robes worn by the tech priests and Skitarii are now symbolic of belonging to the cult Mechanicus, but originally during this time they were more practical. It seems likely that these red robes were worn as a means of camouflage when fighting the various warring groups during the time of civil unrest on Mars and after the tech priests' expeditions to the surface. As the cult of the machine would slowly gain strength and become the dominant group on Mars, you would see things slowly start to be salvaged and rebuilt, but with now a new template and design. The factories and forges of Mars would become temples to the machine god. The Mechanicum's Temple of All Knowledge contained a high altar database, which contains all the knowledge of the tech priests. Every temple on Mars and across its many forge worlds is still connected to this database by a living link, a psychic servitor whose mind connects all altars of the cult into one holy entity. The key thing to remember with the cult Mechanicus is that while it's true that yes, they do worship machines, they also believe that every machine has a spirit, and they believe that efficiency and perfection of function are far superior to anything like emotions or human spontaneity. It's not true to say that they singularly worship machines. This is another common mistake. The cult of the machine is in its purest sense a worship of knowledge. Although yes, it was machines and technology that kept the earliest followers of the machine cult alive, and yes, they do revere machines, it was knowledge that truly kept them alive. To the cult, knowledge is the supreme manifestation of divinity. Creatures, life forms, ancient artifacts, even machine intelligence are no more or less divine than flesh and blood creatures. To the cult, a man is simply an organic machine. His true worth is the sum of his knowledge. So you might be thinking, so they love all things, organic and machine? Not quite. By the cult's own tenets, life as we think of it has no intrinsic value. Disciples of the cult understand that from the earliest days a functioning machine was a lot more valuable to them than the lives of many biological men. It's why having billions of lobotomized human-machine hybrid servitors on Mars does not weigh heavily on anybody's conscience. It's knowledge that is divine, not individuals and not matter. If an individual has no significant knowledge, then carving them up to serve a function is no moral quandary for the Mechanicus. That individual is just an organic machine there to be utilized. It's why also they place no special value in their own organic selves and are more than happy to augment and carry out heavy body modifications to extend their life and improve themselves in any way possible. Because ultimately, it's just weak organic matter. Better to replace it with strong machine components. The cult, though, does value the strength of machines more highly than biological creatures, so this is where you begin to forge the perception of the cult of the machine. It's simply that the way they see physical attributes as opposed to divine shouldn't be conflated as one and the same. The tech priests and the cult began to see that loss of knowledge was often down to biological physical weaknesses or limitations. This is why they began to replace and augment their own bodies to emulate machine kind. For millennia now, the Mechanicum would rule over Mars, having managed to restore some semblance of order. With its forged cities, each under the rule of a high tech priest, collectively being ruled by the Fabricator General. And he is a political leader at this time, but simultaneously the high priest of the cult. But unlike later, Mars at this time would actually also have a parliament, and the Fabricator General acted as more as the head speaker. Now, as we pass into the later period of the Age of Strife, periodically things were now beginning to calm and some travel was possible, albeit for limited periods. The Mechanicum, now having some strength renewed, would use these lulls in the warp storms as an opportunity to begin to send out exploratory missions consisting of Titan legions. Some of these exploratory missions would be lost for all time. Others would reach their destinations but then be cut off from contact, left to establish new forge worlds alone. Fragmented transmissions would sometimes be received by the altar in the Temple of All Knowledge on Mars, where the cult would learn that their new forge worlds had been established or significant technological discoveries had been made. Unspecifically around this time is when the Mechanicum's primary quest, which still exists to this day, became to recover any and all STCs or their related knowledge. STCs are standard template constructs. They're essentially computers which act as 3D printers and a hard copy database for all human knowledge from the Dark Age of technology combined. In the current period, they are more of a myth and exponentially rare. Another section of the goal is to locate STC printouts. These are the hard data sheets that can be used to print new patterns and designs from lost colonies. These can be anything from immense war machines to agricultural tech. STCs were designed to be a font of all knowledge for humanity, and they remain so to the current time, albeit the likelihood of finding an intact STC is ever diminishing. They are so valued that even rumours of an STC fragment is enough for the Mechanicus to launch huge fleets and operations to attempt to locate and recover them. It's worth noting also that humanity are not the only ones who hunt STCs, given their immense and advanced database of knowledge. Even the enemies of humanity will attempt to secure STC data if the opportunity presents itself, and they are well aware of their existence and what they represent. So the Mechanicum was launching these expeditions, and many, through literal restriction by the warp, were more localized and would end up clashing with the warring tribes on Terra. There was still much abandoned advanced technology from the Dark Age technology on Terra, and the Mechanicum wanted to collect and utilize it. This somewhat state of skirmishing war would continue until the late period of M30, when the Emperor won victory in the Unification Wars and would then travel to Mars. Then though, we come to the Machine God, Omnissiah, and Machine Spirit. What is the Machine God? So we're back to some terms here that can get a bit vague and confusing. So again, for clarity, let's try and break it down. Now, when it comes to the Machine God, the simplest way to think about it in terms of a literal representation is to just think of it like a god that you know. So for generic analogy's sake, let's take the common Christian stereotype: white hair, white beard, angry chap, calm down later. Like that, but not that. We're just thinking of the Machine God in the same sense of that as a being. The Mechanicus believe the Machine God to have given rise to all technologies and enabled them through his chosen men across mankind, hence again the worship of knowledge. There are though some disturbing speculations that the Machine God, which some tech priests believe is actually even now housed deep within Mars, is in actuality not a benevolent god, but a fragment of a C'tan known to the Eldar as Magladroth, the Void Dragon. If you forget what C'tan are, they are the world-ending godlike creatures previously worshipped by the Necrons. Magladroth is a figure of wanton destruction and oblivion, one of the most powerful of all the star gods. It would literally eat stars and enabled its warriors to be near invincible. The key thing is that eventually Magladroth, the Void Dragon, would be shattered by the Necrons, who rebelled against the C'tan, into shards. And while these shards are only small fragments of a whole C'tan, they are still unimaginably dangerous. Now, how can we know of this outlandish tale that is so far out of the realm of time? Well, some of this information comes from a Martian tech priest, Semyon. According to him, the Void Dragon of Mars was defeated in combat by the Emperor on ancient Terra, and then imprisoned under the surface of Mars in the Noctis Labyrinth, pre-Age of Strife and pre-Mechanicum. Here it's remained for many millennia. And how does this tech priest Semyon know? Well, he is a guardian of the dragon. And these guardians, like Semyon, are tasked with keeping others, surprisingly, away from the Void Dragon or Machine God, but find that their proximity enables them to be able to share some of its memories. Now, just how much of these memories are real, illusionary, or even imagined remains highly questionable. And the descriptions given are that of the Emperor fighting a dragon as long ago as the period of Millennium 2, and tying his banner around the dragon, unable to fully destroy it before lifting it to Mars. It's more allegorical than literal, but it does appear that the Emperor fought the C'tan Void Dragon shard and then subsequently imprisoned it deep within Mars, long ago, far before the creation or idea of the Mechanicum would come to pass. But it is also believed by some that due to the dragon or shard's influence, it has actually helped in the creation of the cult of the machine, and that potentially the Emperor himself set in motion the rise of the Mechanicum, using these dragons' dreams to be some kind of inception into the minds of the tech priests and their followers. A concept so destructive that if it were ever shown to be true, would potentially destroy the relationship between the Mechanicus and the Imperium, and even the cult Mechanicus itself. And this concept of the Emperor knowing all and seeing all leads us to the Omnissiah. Now again, the Omnissiah and the Machine God are not the same thing. The Machine God is the Machine God, and the Omnissiah is the physical manifestation, the avatar of the god of the cult of the machine. Some see the Omnissiah as more like a prophet for the Machine God. And who is the Omnissiah of the cult Mechanicus? The Emperor of Man, of course. There are multiple reasons for this. Upon arriving on Mars, the Emperor's impressive presence alone was enough for the followers of the machine cult to sit up and take notice. He appeared in line with a Mechanicum prophecy about the Omnissiah, as well as demonstrating an ability to apparently repair machinery with a mere touch. This is probably exaggerated, but it's enough to say he had immense skill and knowledge of machines. And this knowledge and understanding of all things was more than enough to convince many tech priests that this was the Omnissiah they had been awaiting. The Emperor, with his newly formed Imperium of Man, proposed a treaty with the Mechanicum. He would come before the Mechanicum Parliament on Mars and propose the Treaty of Olympus, which stated that if they were to supply arms to his armies and support the Imperium with a powerful war fleet, he would in turn protect and respect the sovereignty of their Forge Worlds. More importantly, he pledged to not interfere with the internal structure or beliefs of the Mechanicum. All things considered, the Parliament of Mars and Fabricator General of the Mechanicum would agree to this alliance. However, being successful on the face of it was not the whole truth of the matter. This alliance did not sit well at all with everyone. At this time, the Fabricator General did not rule over the Mechanicum singularly. They had a parliament to make decisions like that of the alliance to the Imperium. Many members of the Mechanicum, including Fabricator General Kelbor Hal, who was the Speaker of the Martian Parliament, but would then later become the overall leader of the Mechanicum, resented this treaty. He was deeply distrustful of the Emperor and instead saw him as a false prophet, who had then essentially subordinated the Mechanicum under the Imperium. He feared that the Emperor and his vast forces of Astartes would strip away Mars's autonomy and amalgamate them into the workings and beliefs of the Imperium, which, remember, at this time was entirely secular, a direct clash with everything that Mechanicum had come to believe. So Mars at this time would now become the centre of production for the Imperium of Man. The Great Crusade had begun, and the Emperor's mission to reunite the lost colonies of humanity was well underway. The immense Forge World of Mars would now begin producing the ships, arms and armour required by the Imperium, and the Crusade would also, as the Emperor promised, locate and reunite the lost Forge Worlds of the Mechanicum. Forge and Night Worlds would again be discovered, and new Forge Worlds are established near mineral-rich planets, all pushed to maximum production rates. One such example of the many reunited Forge Worlds is Vos Prime. On arriving here, the Crusade fleets found Vos Prime to be modelled unsurprisingly after the Forge World of Mars. Vos was found to be highly efficient and capable in turning out armaments for the Imperium, having located and made use of element-rich nearby asteroid fields. These also doubled as a defence for the planet, making approach to the world difficult to navigate, and Vos Prime pattern vehicles are revered among the Imperium, but their plasma weapon production less so, because despite a high output capacity, Vos Prime has far less success in producing plasma tech than other Forge Worlds. And it's an example of how closed and insular the Mechanicus can be when it comes to resolving any kind of issue which they consider to be at the very core of their sense of being. The Mechanicum will begin to use its influence to retain exclusive trading rights with many of these worlds, including the Night Worlds. Tech priests refer to the Crusade as the time of great expansion, as many Night Worlds are reunited with Mars during this time. All seemed to be going well, but then of course would come the heresy, the traitorous rebellion by the War Master Horus Lupercal that would throw the entire Imperium into a disastrous period of brutal civil war. The Mechanicum was not exempt from this event. The only difference was that while some units sided with the traitors and others loyal to the Imperium, many of the Mechanicum also chose to remain neutral and simply remain also on Mars, or whatever Forge World they happened to be on. Kelbor Hal, the now Fabricator General of the Mechanicum, the sole leader, was convinced by Horus to join with the heretics on the condition that autonomy of the Mechanicum would be ensured. Kelbor Hal had already resented the Emperor since their alliance and would seize on this opportunity to turn on the Imperium, as well as the falsehoods and fallacies that he believed it to represent. Kelbor Hal also ensured that Horus would turn over to him STCs that the sons of Horus had captured from the Oretian technocracy. The Oretians had used the STC to develop their civilization, and their military even used power armor similar in design to that of Space Marines. When the ruler of the Oresian technocracy mentioned unwittingly in passing to Horus in their initial meetings that they had an STC in their possession, Horus at this time, already having decided to split from the Emperor's ways, drew his pistol and killed the Oresian leader on the spot. Later records would show that the Oresian leader held a staff with a weapon containing such advanced power it could have assassinated Horus where he stood. This gives an idea of the power that STCs contain and the level of advanced knowledge they have the potential to reveal. They are, after all, the fonts of knowledge from the zenith of human technological achievement. The war between Horus's forces and the Oresians was then far from straightforward and took nearly a year to conclude. The final battle for the Oresian world was noted as being particularly brutal, with Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, rampaging and slaughtering soldiers and civilians indiscriminately. The multiple high-value STCs recovered from this conflict were the bargaining chips Horus required to bring Kelbor Hal and the powerful Mechanicum to the side of the traitors. Hal, though, also would demand that the Vaults of Forbidden Technology be opened, otherwise known as the Vaults of Moravec. Primus Moravec was part of the Brotherhood of Singularitarianism. They were initially from the Pan-Pacific Empire on Terra and believed that mankind would eventually come upon a technological singularity resulting in a greater than human intelligence. This was deemed even in these early days as heresy, and so Moravec fled to Mars, where he founded the Vaults and apparently meshed technology with ancient entities of the warp. The inherent dangers that can be read into this are clearly apparent. And as such, when the Emperor arrived on Mars, gaining the alliance with the Mechanicum, part of his treaty with them was to ensure that the Vaults of Moravec never be opened. This angered some members of the Mechanicum, and hence why Kelbor Hal now demanded they be opened again. Horus would grant Hal's request and give him the access codes to the vault, where inside they would discover, among many ancient artifacts, a scrap code. Now, scrap code generators are extremely dangerous devices. They are mechanisms of heresy of the highest order. Coupling Imperial machine spirits, they inflict an electronic virus pattern into existing data currents. These patterns then disrupt the currents and induce electronic seizures, shattering the machine spirit and then being reformatted. This leaves the machine spirit with new functions and, most importantly, new loyalties. Which again leads us neatly to what is machine spirit. This is one of the things that people probably rightly get most confused by. What is machine spirit? Is it a Ghost in the Shell style thing? Is it, say, machines' automatic systems? Or is it none of those things? Is it just a religious doctrine that is there for believers to take strength from? The answer is, it's all of those things. Land Raiders and Drop Pods are two notable examples of Imperial tech containing machine spirit, as they're able to make their own course corrections, process target acquisition, and so on. A Land Raider can even take full control of itself for short periods of time. And while this could be taken as being a form of AI, this is carefully sidestepped around as having simply a particularly strong or active machine spirit. Now, Imperial Titans exhibit some of the strongest machine spirits, as they require a cybernetic interface with a human in order to properly function. This individual is usually the commander of a Titan and is known as the Princeps. They use a mind impulse unit to allow connection between the human and the Titan's machine spirit, read its automatic systems, and likely a basic, if not even more advanced, level of AI. The process of connecting a human mind to these machines is highly difficult and dangerous, as Titans have powerful machine spirits. The true strength of a Titan machine spirit is little spoken of, and they have very instinctive intelligence. The Princeps must break the machine's opposition with immense willpower before being able to make it function. Only 1 in 10 million human individuals possess the mental strength to become a Princep of a Titan. And because of this, a Princep is one of the few human individuals that both the Mechanicus and Imperium will go to extensive lengths to recover alive if they are damaged or lost in battle. They are that important of an individual. Machine spirit to the followers of the cult Mechanicus is a very real thing, but it's an abstraction of reality. It's not an actual thing in the strictest sense, but it is highly important to those of the cult Mechanicus, because this belief in the spirit of machine comes from their core beliefs. right from the beginning of the Mechanicum. In these matters it helps to look to some of the Cult Mechanicus' 16 universal laws. The first and second laws come within the first 8 laws, which are titled the Mysteries of the Cult Mechanicus. The first law stating that life is directed motion. The second law stating the spirit is the spark of life. Then when you look at the second 8 laws which come under the warnings of the Cult Mechanicus, 14 states the machine spirit guards the knowledge of the ancients, and lastly 16 which states to break with ritual is to break with faith. And what you can infer is that for the Cult Mechanicus, the sense of ritual to the machine spirit, its importance to them in guiding not just machines to operate, but also curating and guarding the knowledge contained within them, runs at the very core of their beliefs. Now it may be true that something as relatively simple as a gun of any design does not literally require the hours of blessing and rituals that may be bestowed upon something like a Space Marine's bolter, or even to a guardsman's lasgun where all it gets is a quick mumbled prayer and a polish and it's good to go. But something as complex as Imperial Titans does necessitate a much stronger sense of ritual and understanding of the machine spirit, however you loosely interpret what that actually means. It also cuts to something that is fundamental to the Mechanicum and Mechanicus, that sense of duty and care to the machines, tending to them, maintaining their machine spirit, something that the lack of previously caused the destruction of Mars as it was known. So concreting this sense of ritualistic duty to followers of the cult of the machine is as much about a literal sense of needing to keep their machines physically operational just as much as it is a spiritual thing. So back to the heresy, the Vault and the Scrap Code. This period would be later titled The Death of Innocence and was the beginning of the Schism of Mars and the rise of the heretical Dark Mechanicum. Now, Lucas Crom, a tech priest and master of one of Mars's largest forges, as well as one of the founding members of the Dark Mechanicum, before outright heresy had even begun, Crom had been constructing a contentious machine known as the Caban. Despite the ban on AI, he had ignored this fact, and so when the Dark Mechanicum was on the cards, he was solidly on board. The Caban machine had been largely kept secret, but with a few rumours whispered through the forge about some kind of AI machine being constructed. The Caban machine was a tracked machine equipped with void shielding and extensive strange weaponry, and Crom would unleash this sentient AI machine before a fully open civil war was declared against one of the loyalist reactor complexes. The Caban destroyed most of its opposition, but after the reactor's explosion, it was not able to be located. Other unofficial assaults would occur at this time, including by a traitor Titan Legion, the Legio Magna, otherwise known as the Flaming Skulls. They assaulted a forge in the Madla crater, where they smashed through the forge entrance in minutes as the screaming war machine's engines powered through, crushing and incinerating anything in front of them. Destroying thousands of years worth of knowledge near instantaneously, the assault so fast and brutal, the forge was a burning mess of broken ferrocrete and molten slag before anyone knew what was happening. The Caban machine was later to be discovered by a cargo hauler who was then killed when Crom asserted it belonged to him and ordered the Caban to obey his commands, which now included seeking to execute one Dahlia Cythera, a young Terran girl who would become part of a plan to draw knowledge from the warp itself. Crom had previously already attempted to have her put to death for her progressive thinking and for her tech heresy, but was unsuccessful thanks to Coriel Zeth. Zeth was an adept of Magma City, a forge located inside of an active volcano on Mars. Zeth was an interesting figure because while at face value was a loyal disciple of the machine god, she inwardly did not believe and was more dedicated to the pure acquisition of knowledge. To that end, Zeth had been seeking access to the Akashic, a source within the warp that required immense psychic energy poured into an empath to access it. Zeth believed that if this could be accessed, it could enable them to collect the sum total of all knowledge in the universe. She realized that Dahlia Cythera's mind, that was young and not overtly constrained by Mechanicum dogma, could assist her, and so together they attempted to complete the Akashic Reader and channel its energy. By now, the unleashing of the corrupt chaos-infected scrap code by Fabricator General Kelbor Hal led to large-scale unrest, communication breakdowns on and off-world, and general literal devastation. Multiple facilities would be destroyed, and a large number of astropaths would die on Mars when their life support systems were poisoned by the corrupted scrap code. Few knew who or what had caused this assault on the Mechanicum, and so those loyal to Kelbor Hal attempted to recruit other tech priests, telling them that this was in fact the Emperor's doing, that he was never to have been trusted, and now that as part of his crusade he longed to conquer Mars for his Imperium. While the viral spread of the tainted scrap code was devastating to Mars, it was not as successful as Kelbor Hal had thought it may have been. Several sites across Mars were nearly entirely unaffected, as they were now using a more secure information network known as the Noosphere. These designs had been recovered from ancient vault tombs on Terra by explorator Adept Laszlo. The Forge of Magma City was also unintentionally protected by the Akashic Reader, as Szeth and Dahlia Cythera attempted to draw the information they were trying to get out of the warp. They would be unsuccessful, and instead would accidentally flood Magma City with the Emperor's warp energy, shielding it from the scrap code assault. The Reader would though imbue Dahlia with some memories of the Void Dragon of Mars, and this would lead to an expedition to the Noctis Labyrinth. The Dark Mechanicum at this time were confused and fearful that their assault hadn't worked as well as they thought with the scrap code, and were more outraged when they had heard that the young Dahlia was partly responsible for the protection of Magma City. Deciding that Dahlia should be terminated, they sent out again the Kaban machine, as Dahlia and her expedition were nearing the entrance to the Noctis Labyrinth. But two Imperial Knights would overcome the AI machine whilst taking critical damage themselves. Dahlia and her cohorts would then meet the Dragon Guardian Semyon, where she would be appointed as the new Guardian of the Dragon. The Kaban machine is believed to have fought through the Schism of Mars, but its ultimate fate is unknown beyond this point. Kelbor Hal had resisted outright declaration of war against the other members of the Mechanicum, but he was soon to be given an opportunity to launch his forces into battle. Koriel Szeth would resist calls by Kelbor Hal to come before him as the Fabricator General, and when faced with his now distorted and modified Skitarii that now appeared wretched after the power unleashed by the scrap code, Szeth was again demanded to come before the Fabricator General on the grounds of her experimentation with technology and allowing non-cult Mechanicum personnel to work on divine machinery. She was to be placed in custody and put on trial for tech heresy. But facing multiple knights standing loyally aside Szeth, the Dark Mechanicum Skitarii forces were unable to get her to follow them. But it was not this, but ultimately her outright declaration that she did not believe the Omnissiah actually existed, and technology was science and reasoning, not blind faith. This was just what Kelbor Hal had been waiting for, and upon declaring them heretics to the millennia of established cult dogma, he would unleash open war and attempted to wrest control as Mars would descend down into its own civil war. Some areas of Mars took huge volleys of nuclear missiles from the Dark Mechanicum silos. Titans fought each other in huge battles of world-ending scale, with the vast machines ripping and shredding each other, leaving massive ruins of burning scrap scarring the planet's surface. Mass infantry battles were also waged at the Herschel Impact Basin between Skitarii and Protectors, with numbers on the battlefield easily reaching 1 million individuals, where in the aftermath nearly all were killed in that specific engagement. But massive loss of life was occurring everywhere on the planet. At Ismenias Lacus Forge City, where the Dark Mechanicum would then unleash the horrific virus bombs, inflicting some of the most catastrophic casualties of the heresy period. In this instance, an estimated 14 million would die in minutes. In another instance, with the battle raging above the planet in space around Mars as well as on the surface, the Mechanicum Glorian would be sent crashing to the surface of Mars itself, killing billions. The Dark Mechanicum would wage a massive assault on Magma City, and this would become the spearhead for the resistance of Loyalists. Open war was now being fought across the planet for both civilian and military Mechanicum citizenry alike. As the battle around Magma City intensified, it was now facing the Legio Mortis Titan Legion, known as the Death's Heads. They were known for being suspiciously loyal to the Fabricated General and not the Emperor. Most of the Death's Head's Titans fell into the decay of the Chaos God Nurgle. The loyalist Legio Tempestus and Knights of the Tyrannus would aid Szeth in defending the city. However, they would also face the Imperator Titan Aquila Ignis, which had also been defiled by Nurgle. While the Imperator would destroy the remnants of Tempestus with its sheer immense firepower, this was not before they would destroy near all of the Death's Head Titans. Despite a powerful defense to the invaders of Magma City, they were just too many, and Coriol Szeth's last act would be to detonate the reactors of Magma City, killing herself and all others therein. But in doing so would unleash huge waves of magma that would destroy near all of the assaulting traitors and also prevent them from gaining access to the Akashic Reader. This also succeeded in felling the massive Imperator Titan, with all but its Hellstorm cannon being destroyed. Things were not looking hopeful for the Loyalists on Mars, but then salvation of a kind from a glorious figure in the history of the Imperium would appear, that of Malcador the Sigillite. He would bring a great Imperial fleet to Mars, and under his command Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists would launch 4 companies and a massive Imperial army force to secure the forges of Mars. The northern hemisphere of Mars contained a loyalist arc of forges which were responsible for the bulk production of armour and weapons for the Astartes. So Dawn would choose to strike there to occupy the forges and then push outward to secure others. Captain Sigismund and Camba Diaz of the Imperial Fists were sent to secure the forges of Majos Kane and Lucas Crom respectively. Unfortunately for Captain Camba Diaz, while Kane was loyal to the Imperium, Crom was clearly not, and instead a vicious battle ensued that they had not expected. And while they managed to secure some armour and ammunition resources, they were soon forced to make a displeasingly necessary retreat while taking significant losses. Despite what they had assumed was going to be a fairly successful assault on Mars, it quickly became apparent that the Dark Mechanicum was proving far more powerful and well established than they had anticipated. On hearing the intel that a force of Skitaria infantry and armoured vehicles as well as 2 traitor Titan legions totaling 60 war machines was enough for Captain Sigismund to issue an immediate evacuation order for all loyalist forces. Unfortunately, near all of the Mechanicum resistance, as well as those in the Legio Tempestus and the Knights of Tyrannus, were killed or critically incapacitated fighting the relentless assaults of the Dark Mechanicum. Kane, however, was able to evacuate with the Imperial Fists, but the forges under Kane and Crom's control would suffer such heavy damage to their production capabilities that it would be felt for millennia to come. In this frustrating turn of events, Imperial forces would choose to now blockade Mars, and despite several unsuccessful breakout attempts by the traitors, the Imperial Fists would keep them contained. For now. But then, as Horus Lupercal and his traitors approached Earth for the final battle, things would become significantly more chaotic. Another incident of note here occurs during the last years of the heresy. Once Kane had travelled to Earth and been declared as the loyalist Fabricated General, he was involved with the Mechanicum in the war within the Webway. This was the disastrous situation created by the Emperor's plans to allow humanity to use the Eldar Webways. But when Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, had attempted to warn the Emperor of the coming heresy, he inadvertently caused a major malfunction that led to the Webway portal being breached, and as a consequence, scores of Chaos Demons pouring in. Once these abominations were fought back into the webway, the ongoing process of stabilizing and sealing the webway began. As blockades across the webway tunnels were created, Mechanicum workers would then repair the damaged sections and seal rifts, preventing demons from pouring in. Now Cain had planned, in cooperation with another member of the Mechanicum, Archon Land, to utilize the webway to access and retake their home of Mars from the Dark Mechanicum. On the orders of Cain, a tech priest by the name of Hieronyma was ascended to the role of Archimandrite and was sent as commander of the Mechanicum's military forces in the webway. Now Hieronyma was a fearsome creation. She was an avatar of the cult Mechanicus, and her brain had been fused with a weaponized Domitor-class robot. Clawed feet, fists that could crush power armor, wrist-mounted flamers, and shoulder Volkite and Avenger bolt cannons. One hand also contained a double-barreled energy weapon producing fusion beams. Now within the webway, Callistar was an abandoned Eldar city and was a hub location. It would become a focal point for this war within the webway. Callistar was known as the Impossible City to the Imperial forces because of its strange 360-degree dimensions that gave a highly disorientating sense to the human eye. It also contained a deep chasm beneath Callistar that was determined by the Mechanicum to be so deep that if you fell into it, you would surely die from old age before you reached the bottom, assuming normal sustenance allowing. Callistar, though, would then come under continual assault by demonic hordes, and having only limited approved forces to fight within the secretive location of the webway, whilst the ongoing heresy war was happening outside, made things all the more troubling. Hieronyma, the Archimandrite of Cain's Mechanicum, was sent in as a final defense of the ongoing ruination being thrown upon Callistar by the demons of chaos. The Custodes and Sisters of Silence maintained an ongoing defense for weeks, and when finally Chaos Titans began to swarm the city, the Archimandrite ordered a retreat. However, as per Cain and Land's goals, the Mechanicum intended to abandon the Custodes and Sisters of Silence to the demonic hordes, and were going to instead attempt to then secure a connection in the webway to Mars. This treachery, though, only served as a conduit, for the Demon was now able to leave the Golden Throne, thanks to the sacrifice of 1,000 captured Psykers, and as he plunged into the webway as a blindingly bright star before the Chaos Hordes, shining with such psychic energy that the demons were forced back. The Emperor would pierce straight into their midst and reap them with horrific fury and vengeance. This whirlwind of psychic fury invigorated the Custodes, who flew back to fight by the Emperor's side, and the Emperor at this stage even summoned an army of loyal Imperial dead, including Ferrus Manus, the Primarch of the Iron Hands, who fought as a blazing spectre alongside the Emperor. This battle would give enough of a lull in the demonic assaults to retreat back to the gates of the webway portal and allow the Emperor to retake his position on the Golden Throne and seal it. Ultimately, as we know, the Loyalist forces are victorious, and after Horus was slain by the Emperor himself being mortally wounded, would come the period of the Great Scouring. Campaigns of brutal and unrestrained vengeance by the Loyalist forces that kept the now shambolic mess of traitors running all the way back to the Eye of Terror in a very short period of time. But currently little is known about Mars in this time other than it comes back under Loyalist control. The fabricated general of the Dark Mechanicum, Kal-Bahal's fate is also unknown at this time. It's open to speculation until otherwise asserted in official documents what occurred on Mars now. And to me the most likely scenario is that along with the traitorous Astartes, the Dark Mechanicus realised that with their leader slain, the keystone was broken and they fell into panicked disorder. Perhaps the Dark Mechanicum realised that facing off alone against the rage of the Astartes firestorm that was coming their way from Terra was a fight best avoided, even with their quite significant firepower. It was certainly known that not all members of the Mechanicum strongly sided one way or the other during the heresy, and it's plausible that some, if not many, of those on Mars remained in a fairly menial capacity, following orders but not getting overtly involved. Or perhaps they initially believed the Fabricator General that they were under assault from the Imperium, with it only dawning on them later, once the time to leave had passed, that they had badly misjudged this situation. Probably when they began to see Skitarii being hideously mutilated and deformed. So if those members of the Cult of the Machine remained, it's anyone's guess as to if they would be granted some kind of reprieve or just incinerated on the spot for heresy. That certainly wouldn't be out of the remit of the Imperium when dealing with potentially tainted heretics or just people that have been in close proximity to chaos. However, it's worth remembering that for one, the Mechanicum was still considered a fairly separate entity, and that maybe they just deferred judgment to the remaining Mechanicum Council and Kane. It's also worth considering that after the assault on Terra, the Imperium urgently needed production and resupply. Crippling its largest and nearest forge world by executing any and all survivors who remained may not have been the smartest tactical move, but at this point it's all speculative. In the time of the Scouring is when Rabuc Guilliman, whose name I really get sick of pronouncing, would assign Archmagus Dominus Belisarius Cawl with his secret missions in uncharted space to work on the creation of the Primaris Space Marines with the Sang Primus Portum, and to resurrect Guilliman should things go badly wrong, which they unfortunately did. The Sang Primus Portum is an Imperium artifact that contains the genetic material of all 20 Primarchs. Now, the relatively previously unknown Cawl has now become a critically important figure in the history of the Imperium of Man, and first appears during the Horus Heresy. In this time, he was a tech acolyte on the Mechanicum world of the Trisolian system. While Cawl believed the Emperor was the Omnissiah, he did not agree with much of the Mechanicum's teachings, inasmuch as he believed, similarly to Szeth, that they should innovate rather than merely maintain through rituals and faith. In his early time, he believed more strongly in the human form and resisted much of the more common body augmentations you see in the Mechanicus. He did though perform illegal internal enhancements like brain surgeries on himself to increase his own intelligence. When the traitors came to his system and his master bowed to the will of Horus, Cawl found he had little choice if he wanted to survive other than to feign submission. But later Cawl would kill his former master Aspertia, absorbing his intelligence core and his knowledge of cloning in the process, before fleeing the system. In terms of Cawl's task for the Primarch of the Ultramarines, he was successful in both counts, yet Guilliman does not fully trust Cawl, despite his massive achievements, because whilst Cawl has shown nothing but total devotion to the Imperium, he also has bordered on heretical experimentation, notably a creation known as the Cawl Inferior. This is a complex machine only accessible to the Primarch Guilliman, and its purpose is to allow him to engage with it in pre-programmed responses, status updates, and answer any number of theoretical scenarios. But it also contains the sum total of its creator's knowledge, and is in place as a backup were Cawl to die himself. However, while Guilliman is led to believe by Cawl that the machine is just pre-programmed to give responses and not actually Cawl himself, it is deceptive, to the point of being highly suspect. Guilliman partly suspects that the machine is not simply giving responses, but is in fact a fully aware artificial intelligence, as the device has been known to become emotional and even lying to him on occasion. Situations such as this, and the fact that Cawl's general actions across the past 10,000 years to the current time have led many across the Adeptus Mechanicus to be fairly hostile towards him, give cause for Guilliman to respect him, but simultaneously keep him at somewhat arm's length. Returning though back to the 31st millennium, and Forge Master Zagreus Kane would be named as the new Fabricator General of the Loyalist Mechanicum, in name only. Kane's embittered feelings to the events that had unfolded pushed him to further augment himself, to the point that by the late period in the heresy he had few human features remaining, and now used tracks as his mobility in place of legs. Kane's frustrations also led to him having an ever more unstable attitude. This made many of his closest followers reach for some kind of resolution to the impasse of the Mechanicum leadership. The Mechanicum considered the issue of both Kel-Bahal and Kane claiming the Fabricator General position as an unresolved equation in their thinking. While Kel-Bahal was undoubtedly a traitor to the Imperium, he was still the Fabricator General of the Mechanicum, which, despite its previous alliance treaty, did not sit under the banner of the Imperium but had been allowed to stand independently. To resolve this issue, Ambassador Vethril, a tech priest in the Mechanicum, she had actually few outward bionics for a figure in her position and was Kane's representative on the Council of Terror. Well aware that something was needed to allow Kane to strengthen the ailing cause of the Loyalist Mechanicum, including the vitally important Collegia Titanica, she suggested that the Mechanicum should be moved to Adeptus status within the Imperium, something that would give them representation on the Council of Terror. This was not a popular opinion among tech priests or Adeptus Terra members at the time. She even faced assassination attempts for her ideas, but ultimately, thanks to Kane's support and some intimidation by the Legio Ignatum, which is another Titan legion, Vethril was successful. Despite the Loyalist Mechanicum Council's concerns about their ability to function independently from the workings of the Imperium of Man, the resolution ultimately would pass when the Collegia Titanica forced their hand, threatening to abandon the war in the Terran solar system toward the end of the heresy period. For them to do this would have been catastrophic. These events would lead to the abandonment of the pre-heresy Mechanicum as an organization and the creation of the now well-established Adeptus Mechanicus. One thing though is that it would be interesting to imagine how different things could have been had Szeth survived and her progressively minded anti-religious knowledge-seeking agenda been allowed to proliferate through the Mechanicus. But sadly it was not to be, and instead the Mechanicus returned to praying machines would work by burning incense. Never mind. Once Zagreus Kane is placed as the Fabricator General of the new Adeptus Mechanicus, he also joins the group known as the High Lords of Terror to oversee the workings and decisions of the Imperium of Man. The purges and events after the heresy set the Mechanicus back heavily in their goals. Swathes of data had been lost and behemoth-sized facilities lay in ruin. It was a horrific wound, largely self-inflicted by the Mechanicus. It still struggles to recover much if any of the priceless achievements from its past period of technology gathering around the end of the Age of Strife. During the time immediately after the heresy and scouring, the Mechanicus is now focused on its work rebuilding, re-establishing contact and bringing its Forge Worlds back online. It also has to begin reacquiring forces to bolster its heavily damaged Skitarii units and assess damage inflicted across its bastions throughout the galaxy. Between the time of Rebirth to the current period in the 41st millennium, many further events take place in varying severities, including multiple new Fabricator Generals taking the place of Kane. I hope to cover these ongoing revelations in a future video to bring us up to date, or perhaps when future details about the retaking of Mars and any subsequent consequences come along. All of this aside, the final thoughts for the Mechanicus in this are that the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Cult Mechanicus spend the next 10,000 years entrenching their religious dogma and further strengthening their military forces. The tech priests of Mars continue to worship the Emperor as the Omnissiah, but not under the Imperial cult. The overarching goals of the Mechanicus remain the same as ever, an unrelenting quest for knowledge by any means necessary. The primary goal remains, no matter how unlikely, that of finding an intact functioning STC. This becomes ever more unlikely as time passes, and STC printouts, while some of high importance have been found, early colonist needs from STC units were usually simple, and so more complex theoretical data and advanced tech are unlikely to have been printed as hard copies. The authority of the Adeptus Mechanicus in all matters technological remains unquestioned, as does the belief in the machine spirit and moreover the sense of machines as being sacred. Even non-initiated ordinary Imperial citizens will treat machines with a reasonable amount of respect and would be careful not to intentionally misuse a machine, and certainly not in the presence of others. The Mechanicus and its tech priests are literally essential to the running, operation and maintenance of the Imperium's worlds and forces. Every fleet, every ship, every world will have tech priests there to supervise and attend to the needs of the tech. Its Forge Worlds are essential to the manufacture and commerce of entire sectors in the Imperium. Even the Adeptus Astartes send their own to Mars to learn the ways of the machine and become tech marines. Without the Adeptus Mechanicus, it is highly questionable whether the Imperium as it currently stands will be able to survive considering the severity of threats that it faces. But even so, one of the Mechanicus's biggest criticisms, even among its own, is its poor ability in replicating and backwardly engineering tech that is discovered. Even now, if they find working old tech, the Mechanicus's copies are usually poor imitations and sometimes even dangerous to the users. The cult treats innovation with high levels of skepticism. Instead of trying to understand and unlock the secrets of the most powerful ancient technology, they're satisfied to simply maintain it and worship it with religious dogma. There are, though, a growing many who believe, as did Coriol Zeth, that this is not the way forward, and more recently those like Belisarius Cawl are taking literal actions that go openly against the grain of the established Mechanicus dogma, much to many in the Cult of the Machine's disapproval. Some would posit that the way of the original Mechanicum has been now lost, that those original survivors from the Age of Strife on Mars before the Mechanicum and Cult of Machine even existed, growing numbers of voices within the Mechanicus now seem to support the idea that gaining knowledge, which was the core of the Cult of the Machine, has been supplanted by simple banal worship of its function. There are few tech priests, if truly any, who can even come close to the technical achievements of their ancient predecessors. And we're talking about those in the very early Cult Mechanicus here. Forget about the humans of the Dark Age of technology. As time passes, more of mankind's knowledge is eroded away. Strange technology rituals replace understanding, and the most complex of machines become mythical. We'll return to the world of Mechanicus when we next look at the periods from the end of the heresy forward to the current time, and break down more of its internal structure. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. There once was a man born in a forgotten time, created by a force of unknown origin. He would cross the ages knowing his one purpose: to lead humanity as the greatest empire in the galaxy, the Imperium of Man. In this time he would be known by only one name: the Emperor of Mankind. This is Lutin. I must first apologise for the length of time since the last project. The simplest explanation is it took me a long time to compile amid many other things going on for me. So we now move on from the Eldar history and wade into one of the most important and complicated narratives in the universe of the 41st millennium. It is, of course, the rise of humanity and the Imperium. In the dark, never-ceasing war that is the future, humans have risen to control and maintain a galaxy-spanning empire whose official title is the Imperium of Mankind. The Imperium is the largest and most powerful political entity in the galaxy. It has been established for a period of some 10,000 years up to its present date in the age of Warhammer 40k. The lore and scripture around this period is massive. Despite this daunting task though, I've decided to interpret it in one piece chronologically, splitting it into chapters so as to best enable you guys to get an understanding and a grasp of what it is all about. This is the third video in my Warhammer 40,000 lore series, and it seeks to create a foundation for all of the further videos which talk about the Imperium of Man. The Imperium of Man consists of the planets, systems and forces throughout the galaxy which contain Imperial citizens and their derivatives. Not all humans are universally members of the Imperium though, and as you would expect there are rogue traders and those who choose to live on the legal fringes of the society. The single most important figure within the Imperium is the aforementioned founder, saviour and ruler of this empire, known as the Emperor of Mankind. He formed the Imperium some 10,000 years previous to the current established date in the universe of Warhammer 40,000 at the end of the 30th millennium. This occurred following an especially brutal period of societal disintegration during the last days of the Age of Strife. In this video, I'll outline the political state that is the Imperium, as well as the history behind how humanity reached this point in the far future. As with anything though, the complexity and depth of the lore means I can't cover it in its fleshed entirety, so some tangents are going to have to remain for future videos, but I do my best to cover as much as possible which is relevant. The Emperor of Man sits as an extremely powerful figure within the Imperium. Make no mistake, he is the centre of humanity in the 41st millennium. So powerful a humanoid, he was arguably barely human to begin with, and he continues to protect mankind after his mortal wounding during the final battles of a period known as the Horus Heresy. Were it not for his ever-present psychic voice reaching out, searching, protecting and planning, then the Imperium of Man would undoubtedly fall back into dark oblivion, and perhaps the light would be extinguished permanently. The Emperor was injured so badly after the heresy that he now exists only as a husk of a man within a stasis chamber called the Golden Throne. This allows him to live on eternally as he has done for some past 10,000 years, whilst continually guiding mankind through psychic whispers. The only catch with this is thousands of psykers are sacrificed every day using their essence and psychic power to keep him alive, as he is heavily protected and attended to back on the ancient homeworld of legend, Terra, or Old Earth. The Imperium of Man in the wider galaxy now consists of many systems, planets and trillions of citizens. All the while the Imperial military and the many administrators of mankind, all of whom swear allegiance to the Emperor, all stand together against the nightmares of the galaxy to form what is humanity in the darkest of futures. Now we know that in this future we have access to highly advanced technology and face many voracious enemies wielding our own forces to then counter them. The important question in understanding the Imperium is how did we get to this time? And to understand this, we need to look back at the extensive and dark history of humanity. There is a small clue as to the way in which the people that constitute humanity in the 41st millennium view their past. That is, the Imperial two-headed eagle, the crest of the Imperium. It stands with its two heads, but with one eye closed. Blind, or perhaps refusing to see the past. The other eye is open, looking to the future. The logic being that the past of humanity is too painful or dangerous to look back on, so we look forward, striving to be stronger and more powerful as we have done for thousands of years. There are distinct ages of humanity's history, and these tell the story of how we reached the time of the Imperium. 1 millennium equals 1,000 years. The Imperium has now been established for 10 millennia or 10,000 years. Humanity has existed for roughly 41,000 years. This timeline demonstrates the ages of man through this period, from our ancient history through to the age of the Imperium. We have the ancient history, the age of terror, the golden age of technology or the dark age of technology, the age of strife, the unification wars, the Great Crusade and the fall of the Eldar, the Horus Heresy and the Great Scouring, followed by the final Age of Imperium of Man. The ancient history tells of the dawn of mankind, but this period is largely one of animalistic evolution. The most significant event occurs around 7000 BC. This event marks the birth of the humanoid, who would become the Emperor of Mankind. His origins are something of a heated debate among the 40k community. There are several theories around this, and it's important to note that something I rarely see stated on forums or discussions around the origins of the Emperor is that quite simply no one knows the origins of the Emperor. It's all just speculation. Simply because one theory has had a vague reference at one time or another does not make it gospel. In fact, as I've repeated before, the crux of the matter with imperial history and lore in general is that very little should ever be considered official or canon. Such is the state of the loss of history, misinformation, and suppression of facts within the 40k universe. So essentially, the correct version is the version you want to believe. In a universe where history is stored over thousands of years and in times of unimaginable devastation and strife, it's unlikely something could be considered a cold, hard fact, especially when you're talking about events that happened in ancient history in an age where accurate recording of information seems unlikely or even impossible to have survived. The first version of these events is the often widely accepted background, which states that in the ancient times some humans carried a natural affinity or awareness of the warp. These were the earliest psykers. They would be village shamans or witch doctors in ancient communities. Their premonitions led them to understand that in the future mankind would face the darkest of times. Their decided course of action would be to commit ritual suicide en masse, returning their souls and essence to the warp to then coalesce and be reborn as one supremely powerful psychic being. This being would then spend the future millennia living a Highlander-like existence, transitioning from identity to identity, sometimes taking on famous leaders in history to steer humanity in the right direction. And then upon reaching the Age of Strife, he would step into the Four to become the supreme leader of all humanity and unite us again throughout the galaxy. Now, some people take this as the most canon version of the Emperor's origin, but there are various others, including the one that I actually personally subscribe to. The shaman story is all very well and good, but it leaves me with some questions. For example, if these shaman were some of the earliest humans with only a vague awareness of the warp, how could they have such powerful precognition to foresee the need to create such a super being? In addition to that, if they were truly the earliest stowings of psykers for humanity, then surely they would not have been especially powerful, and even with their powers combined, how could they summon humanity's greatest champion? No, not Captain Planet. So, those two things stand out for me. Also, their plan to commit mass suicide and then hope that they would all be reborn together seems pretty spurious. It seems to tick the boxes from an okay, I guess that's possible point of view, but it just doesn't make sense beyond that. Another theory is that the Emperor was in fact one of the Old Ones, who you will remember were one of the most ancient super beings who created the Eldar, the Orcs, and even humanity. Yes, really, go and look it up for those naysayers who think that they did not. This theory, again, at first is captivating, until you start to think about it more. And then you realise it doesn't really make any sense. The Old Ones were, as far as we are informed, not shapeshifters, but creatures of light and dark. There was a statement to the fact that just a single Old One escaped the brutal genocide of their race, but then was eventually killed at the birth of Slaanesh when the Eldar fell. If the Emperor was some other escaped Old One, it doesn't make logical sense that they would choose one race and then ultimately lead it. Although I suppose, devil's advocate, who's to say what will be going in the mind of this Old One after his entire race was extinguished? Maybe it had a crisis of conscience. Anything, I guess, is possible. And then not to mention also the fact that the Emperor would lead humanity to wage war on pretty much every other alien race, which wouldn't really serve any purpose within the context of an Old One's mission statement. They were originally life givers. They seeded planets with life to, create new races in the universe. And again, unless it had simply lost the plot and was operating on his own sort of mission plan. There are some things that do fit this theory though, such as Old Ones being very powerful psychic creatures. They had extended precognition, they had very extensive, almost immortal long life, and they would have the ability to genetically manipulate humans. But all of this seems very soft and is only plausible at best. For me, this theory just doesn't really fit. So the last theory, and the one that I personally believe, is that the Emperor was neither the creation of some bizarre suicide pact or an Old One. Rather, something in between. It's fair to say that in any ancient history nothing is quite as it's written, and that some reading between the lines is necessary. The most ancient of history available hints that the last remaining Old One floated around the galaxy, meddling and dabbling and trying to have some last impact on the worlds which they felt they had failed and left their race completely annihilated. We know that the Old Ones were capable of creating beings of immense psychic power. This is how the ancient Eldar defeated the Necrons and Satan, who were, let's not forget, gods capable of devouring stars. So the theory I stand by is that a fragmented remaining Old One drifted around the galaxy until he was struck by a precognition so terrible that he had no choice but to resolve becoming involved. It could be that he saw the vision of the Eldar fall or the rise of chaos. Either way, he knew that the Eldar were by now far too arrogant to accept any help and would be of no use, remembering that the Eldar had turned their backs on the Old Ones long ago. The Orcs, who were also an Old One's creation, they were too crass and mindless for such preparation. Instead, he would turn to the weak humans. Weak, but with great potential. And so he would decide on forming a divine creature, a humanoid of the most immense power, but birthed in such a way that he would not allow those humans would not immediately view him as a god, but as a man, to be not worshipped, but instill a sense of power, of awe, of destiny. There are other clues as well. Apparently, further along in Earth's ancient history, a creature crashed to Earth who had an appearance we would describe as a dragon. It would seem, though, that this dragon was in fact a small fragment of the star gods, the Satan, who had been destroyed thousands of light years away by the Necrons. Even a tiny fragment of these most powerful beings would be beyond the means of even the most powerful humans to contain. The future Emperor in this time wounded this creature and then apparently took it to Mars. I'm not sure how, but there it lay imprisoned within the planet. The final chapter of that story, that's one for another day. Still though, this helps to secure the idea that no mere reincarnation of a few shaman could produce such or perform such a task. Could an Old One? Perhaps, but given the other evidence I would still discount it. But a perfectly designed humanoid of godlike form created by an Old One who would know a most powerful psychic being was needed to counter not just the future darkness of man, but to face again the Satan and the day of reckoning when the Necrons would rise again. This seems for me the most logical and plausible of origins. The truth, though, is that we cannot know the origin of the Emperor unless some definitive tome is discovered which provides secure evidence as to such, so we are left to speculate until then. One thing that is certain, though, is that the Emperor was a human and holds godlike psychic power. He was within humanity throughout all of history, learning, sometimes guiding, mostly sitting in the shadows, until he was needed to take a course of action that would lead us into the Age of the Imperium. The last point worthy of mention is that the Emperor of Man would enforce a strictly secular society. In the early days of the Imperium, this would then enable humanity would identify with him as a man and not as a god. They wouldn't project any religious connotations onto him. Also, because throughout the thousands of years he spent on Earth, he would see the terrible devastation and fragmentation organized religion could cause. He believed that humanity could only achieve its full potential in a strictly secular state. However, even in the crusading period where the Emperor would reunite the lost colonies of man, some people began to spread rumours that he was more than just a powerful man. These beliefs would run so strong it would even question some Astartes to the faith, such as Battle Captain Nathaniel Garrow, one of my favourite characters in the 40k and one of the few Space Marines from the Death Guard chapter not to be corrupted by chaos. Some citizens of the Imperium consider the Emperor's stance on faith even a test so as to distinguish those who can see the whole of the truth, that he is in fact the one true God of mankind. We would now reach the time known as the Age of Terror. This was the period on Earth from the 1st to the 15th millennia, that is the first 15,000 years on old Earth. A period of extreme technological expansion, from a pre-industrial era to that of fusion power and travel beyond our planet and even solar system. Humanity would first colonize new worlds within our system, first on Mars and then the moons of Jupiter, before mankind would start to look at how we could travel beyond. To achieve this next goal, colossal starships were created for humanity to cross the voids between solar systems, and powerful engines at this time, these advanced fusion drives enabled very, very fast but still sublight travel. This meant in order to reach their destination, it could take anything as long as 10 generations of human lifespan to reach their destinations. Subsequently, trade and aid between human colonies was then extremely difficult and would lead to them being established almost as independent states. Very little is known of this period as imperial records are fragmented and limited. The emperor during this time had no reason to interfere and so would continue his own work and research back on Earth. Study and the improvement of man, all the while remaining in the shadows. During the period between the 1st and 15th millennium, various events of discovery and importance took place that would finally propel us to create our first interstellar confederation in the 15th millennium. One of the most important events of note would be during M4. Humanity would discover the warp and begin to research it. This is specifically relevant as it would have been one of the discoveries that would lead the Emperor to understanding the necessity of him coming into the fore. As we reach the 15th millennium, humanity would enter a golden age of technology. This would be the highest point in mankind's technological achievements. It would last for some 10,000 years, and humanity continued its rise in technology, science and power, spreading and colonizing mankind all across the Milky Way galaxy. We could create our first galactic empire, ruled from Earth, the homeworld, and establish massive trade networks that further powered expansion and advancement. This earlier period in the Age of Technology has a subtitle known as the Stellar Exodus. This marks the time when humanity made its first colonies on other worlds, and also beyond the solar system. These initial colonies were reached using the ships that were still only capable of sublight speeds and were restricted by this, as well as our developing but limited knowledge of building these vast scale ships. When these ships reached their destination though, they would be then slowly deconstructed and their materials used to build the colonies. Some would become manufactorums capable of producing massive war machines, or then back then defensive machines, things such as Imperial Knights and even Titans, which the colonies would use to defend themselves against the dangers of the galaxy. In a comparable way to early colonies on Earth, this meant they had to be self-sufficient, and due to the large timescales involved before anyone would likely reach out to them again, they would develop their own cultures and languages, largely influenced by the noble families established on these interstellar voyages, as well as physical elements on the new homeworld. The planet's characteristics would also shape the way in which their societies would evolve. Now, some 6,000 years later, around the period of Millennium 21, mankind now began a process of militarization. It is not known who or for what reason created this process or started it off, but along with our expansion and colonization of planets, we also began to expand and develop our weapons and forces. Fragments of what was developed during this age of technology, such as Imperial Knights, Titans, Land Raider designs and so on, would later be recovered by the Imperium far into the future. The largest proportion, however, would be lost to the tides of time, and we can only imagine or hope to continue recovering these lost and most powerful of technologies in the 41st millennium. Humanity had risen to a period of immense power through our technology, and whilst the Emperor of Man existed, he had not made himself known to mankind. He continued to bide his time, lying in the shadows, studying, planning, observing. The very fact that the Emperor is one of the few who would live through this time and on into the Age of the Imperium, and this would then have far-reaching implications for humanity, as the Emperor would carry his knowledge and strength of this golden age into a time when none would recall it, and where it would be of critical importance to our survival. For the Emperor, he would use this knowledge of the Age of Technology to bring humanity back to a glimmer of what once had been. In the thousands of years where humanity established its first interstellar empire, we would become, as much as the Eldar, supremely dependent on technology. Humankind had risen to a level of godlike understanding, and this was embraced and practiced by the people of the time. The empire of mankind was seen as a bastion of technological achievement and began to use a new class of humans entitled the Navigators to expand our reach and use the newly discovered warp to travel beyond the distances of existing star drives and cover vast distances in a short time. A navigator's role is to, as the name suggests, protect and guide a ship through the tides and dangers of the warp. Eventually, over time, humanity would find the warp had become too turbulent to traverse. But in this time, navigators, they're not strictly psychers as such. They possess a special gene called, unsurprisingly, the navigator gene. They also possess other abnormal characteristics, including a third eye in the forehead, as well as some more alien appearances such as no pupils in their human eyes and translucent skin, as well as maybe larger than normal appendages. Their origin is believed to have not been a natural development, but to have come about through genetic experimentation and engineering in this period of the age of technology. It was likely that mankind discovered the warp and that it could be utilized for crossings, but that required a safe means to traverse it and looked to create a solution to that problem. Mankind's age of expansion and technological glory across the galaxy would lead to many worlds requiring their own localized defense forces. In this time, humanity's mastery of technology was largely unequaled, and this would be employed in the defense and relative growth of the colonies. One of these defense forces, one of the most powerful of them, would be the Imperial Knights. These were colossal war machines that towered over all they surveyed on a battlefield. They were built with the knowledge of the Golden Age of technology, and these giants survived until the Imperial Age, but they can essentially no longer be constructed from scratch. And as is often the case with technology in the Imperium, it is now merely maintained. The Imperial Knights themselves were operated by nobles from the colony worlds who would be entombed within them. They are sworn to protect their citizens from all Xenos threats and the endless nightmares in the universe. As the Knights would advance into the later ages, they continued their noble values and morals. Some of the Knights are the most selfless and dedicated forces within the Imperium, as well as being some of the oldest. As with most technology from the Dark or Golden Age technology, the Knights are immensely powerful, allowing them to run and fight as much as a dreadnought would fight, but on a much larger scale. These ancient heroes have fought thousands of battles across millennia and stand ready to defend Imperial citizens and support Astartes anywhere in the galaxy. After the Knights we have the Titans, and Titans are the epic war machines of the Imperium. A Knight and the smallest Titan can be anything like 9-10 meters, but the big Titans can be anything up to 50 meters. They are gargantuan death machines. Many people believe that the Mechanicum were originally responsible for creating the Titans. This is not strictly correct. They do construct some Titans, but many they simply maintain. This is because the technology used to create Titans is very, very old, and like many things in the universe of Warhammer 40,000 for the Imperium, a lot of technology is merely maintained because of its complexity. Simpler devices are constructed, but this happens less and less. But the Mechanicum do create some Titans for the Imperium. Originally, the Mechanicus found versions that were completely autonomous, created in the Golden Age of technology. And the largest Titan so far discovered was upon the lost forge world of Charania. It was a completely autonomous war machine and was dubbed the Castigator class Titan. Its schematic was apparently also contained within a standard template construct on this planet, and it was far superior to any class of Titan utilized by the Adeptus Mechanicus or any other intelligent race in the galaxy. This was so far the only known discovered Castigator class Titan, but it was subsequently destroyed by Imperial Grey Knights. Grey Knights are the secretive and unbreakable order of Astartes warriors dedicated to the protection of the Imperium from the very darkest foes that humanity faces in the 41st millennium. Now, the portion of the STC database containing the data for the manufacture of the Castigator-class Titan was also destroyed by the Mechanicus. It possessed AI, which is strictly outlawed and heretical within the Imperium. Secondly, it had somehow long ago been corrupted by living chaos energy, and for this reason it could obviously no longer be supported. Imperial records of this event, though, note that the cost of life and resources required to destroy this Titan monstrosity was severe. The key point here, though, is that mankind was developing machines in the Golden Age of technology that would never again be equaled. They could be merely copied, emulated, or used as a template to work from in the future. But our level of knowledge, our rules and guides on what could be created, due in part to events that were yet to come, would very much limit humanity's advancement in the millennia that lay ahead. I mentioned a moment ago something called an STC. This denotes a device known as a standard template construct. These are one of the single most valuable objects in the galaxy for the Imperium, and their importance was no less during the Age of Technology. So what is an STC? STC systems were advanced AI computers created during the Golden or Dark Age of technology, and are said to have contained the sum total of human, scientific and technological knowledge. STCs were created when human interstellar civilization was at its technological peak. Their original purpose was to enable colonists to survive on the new worlds they arrived upon, as they could not carry securely the mass amount of knowledge gained by humanity at this time, and even if they could, they might not have people capable of understanding how to utilize this. The STC solved this problem. It enabled the colonies to access all of humanity's knowledge and display it in a way for them to be able to create anything they needed from the resources available and solve any issue that could arise for them on the new home worlds, no matter the geography, resource limitations or climate. This would enable them to build anything from a simple lasgun to a fortified bunker, massive war machines or an atmospheric processor. STC systems possessed the ability to not just store information, but also to produce new designs to meet changing circumstances. They are immensely powerful sources of information and power, and consequently the Imperium places a high value on obtaining these lost relics of ancient knowledge. Even though now, after many thousands of years had passed, most of the discovered STCs are damaged to the point they only contain fragments of their former stored information. But Imperial forces will still use any means or resources necessary to obtain an STC once it has been discovered, even if this means the sacrifice of legions of military or civilian Imperial citizens. From the Golden Age of technology and into the ages to come, these valuable systems will be lost or destroyed, so that now in the age of the Imperium they have become beyond rare, almost just a legend. So the consequent discovery of remnants of any new technology from the Dark Age of technology puts an STC's value to humanity beyond estimation. The little knowledge that has been recovered from damaged STC units is then utilized, copied and stored by the tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who are based deep on the primary forge homeworld of Mars. They believe that STCs are the most holy of artifacts and will seek and protect them at any cost. This little divergence is an important one because an STC recovery, no matter its state of repair, still remains as one of the most important objectives for Imperial forces in the 41st millennium. The holy grail of this quest, though, although unlikely, would be to recover an intact STC, thereby gifting the Imperium all of the stored knowledge of mankind from the Golden Age of technology. If the Imperium were able to recover an STC of this standard, it would catapult the existing human society into becoming yet again one of the most advanced and significantly, if not the most powerful state in the galaxy. The STC Crusade also explains in part about the state of technology and development of the Imperium, in that much of the knowledge regarding tech is replicated or learned rather than invented and created. Although new tech does come along, it's not overtly specified why so little resources are put into research now. It could be speculated though, however, that mankind relied so strongly upon the Emperor in the last 10 millennia that now they believe only he is capable of directing mankind's advancement, and they solely focus on maintaining him and maintaining the state of Imperial affairs. So we return to our story, and at this time in the Golden Age of technology, humanity continues to expand across the galaxy. initially slowly as the gigantic starships we crafted were incapable of using the warp to traverse space. And as we learned previous, they took generations to reach their destination. They were essentially travelling worlds, similar to the Eldar craft world of the 41st millennium. When these ships reached their destination, they would slowly be deconstructed, and their materials could be used to create massive war machines such as the Imperial Knights and Titans, which the colony could use to defend themselves against the dangers of the galaxy. Dangers such as the Eldar and Orcs, who were first discovered in this period as a result of our reaching out beyond our own system to more regularly explore the galaxy. However, interestingly, during this time, humanity was actually considered more powerful than it is in the 41st millennium. This strength was mainly due to our technology rather than actual physical forces, such as Astartes, who did not exist in this age. Science was humanity's primary religion, and the society of man perceived itself as having reached a time where no one could be a real challenge to us. To a degree, this was actually true, so much so that the Xenos races of Eldar and Orc actually signed non-aggression pacts with mankind, which seems bizarre from the Orc point of view, but there we are. The discovery and use of interstellar drives, that is, an engine enabling cross-warp travel, now powered humanity's expansion and domination of the galaxy forward. A federated government was formed, enabling us to create a strong trade community and, most importantly, remain unified and powerful throughout our colonies spread across the galaxy, aiding and supporting where necessary with either materials, logistics or military. The exact form and nature of this federation is unknown from this time, as so much knowledge and history was lost. To speculate though, it seems likely that from the way in which humans would live at this time, the Federation would have focused more on discovery, science and working to better humanity, as well as supporting our widespread colonies. As the societies we had seeded across the galaxy grew stronger and more developed, most humans would live long, peaceful lives where menial actions were carried out by automation, leaving people time to indulge in their own lives and dedicate themselves to the glorious expansion of mankind. This golden age of peace bears a stark contrast to the unforgiving brutality of the 41st millennium, the Imperium where many citizens are now born into lives that are shorter, work-driven, and even hellish by comparison. Back with our timeline though, and although navigators had now been discovered and enabled interstellar travel, psykers, that is humans with strong psychic ability, had for the longest time evaded or simply passed undetected. It would be in the age of technology where this new class of human would finally be identified. These psykers seemingly largely avoided the demonic possessions which had occurred for the old ones, Orc and Eldar. It is unclear why this would be, but again you may speculate that the Emperor had a role to play in guiding and shielding humanity through this time. As we know, he had always lain in the shadows, ensuring our safety and creating small influence until he felt it was necessary to come to the fore. Another possibility is that by comparison, the Orcs and Eldar with their more advanced psychic powers simply shone brighter. As we know, the demons of the warp are actually attracted to psychic power in real space like moths to a lamp, and so they appeared amid the depths of the galaxy, a brighter beacon for the chaotic creatures to be attracted towards, whereas the human psykers were very early in development, their powers were less attractive, they did not stand out so much. These psychic mutations were initially limited to only a few individuals per billion or so humans, but toward the end of the age of technology, psykers would appear throughout the colonies more widespread than ever before. And some colonies who were advanced and open-minded, they could see the potential advantages brought by human psykers, and they were protected and allowed to develop and explore their abilities. However, on other, less advanced human colonies, they were often killed and hunted down as the people here feared rather than embraced their divergent powers, much of, similar to witch hunts. As I hinted at earlier, one of the reasons during the golden age of technology that humanity was able to not only survive, but stretch itself out to colonize and conquer worlds in the galaxy, not to mention defending itself against aggressive Xenos, would be due to their reliance on AI and the machine creations of the time. However, as nearly all science fiction dictates, these primary sentient machines in the Human Galactic Federation would be known as the Men of Iron, and they would stereotypically turn on their creators and enter us into a cataclysmic war. An STC containing a template for the Men of Iron was discovered by Imperial forces on a Chaos-controlled world. It became apparent that much as the Castigator-class Titan, the Men of Iron here had also been corrupted by Chaos, and the AI of these creations was sentient. So we can perhaps speculate that the Men of Iron initially resented their human creators, but combined with this were also corrupted, possibly by Chaos, which at the time was relatively unknown to mankind, hence the lack of any documentation to support such speculation. It is, however, a possibility and stacks up with what we know of the corruptibility of human AI creations. Also, the intent of the dark forces of Chaos to obliterate humanity once it became aware of its existence. Regardless of the reason though, this war was one of the greatest disasters to befall humanity and would rage for centuries. The exact length of the war is not recorded. The conflict was eventually won by humanity, but at a great cost. The damage caused by this conflict to interstellar human society was hugely destructive. We would lose masses of knowledge and technology, not to mention devastating humanity's economic strength and political unity. The war would begin the series of events that would lead into the collapse of the Federation of Humanity at the end of the Age of Technology. As so often is the case, very little information exists from this time, largely due to the Imperium being so wary of a similar disaster happening again. And this is why amongst the Imperium of mankind you'll find only the simplest forms of AI. It is viewed as being exceptionally dangerous technology and is strictly outlawed. A substitute is often to combine human and machine into mindless drone-like beings known as servitors. Servitors are the Imperium's cybernetic servants, lacking true self-awareness, and are created from the bodies of either condemned criminals who are unpleasantly lobotomized, or vat-grown humanoids whose bodies and brains are partially replaced with machine systems. As a result of this catastrophic conflict between the Men of Iron and humanity in the Golden Age of technology, it is now considered one of the most severe crimes in Imperial society to develop a self-aware artificially intelligent machine. It is just considered too dangerous to even consider. Around Millennium 23, the warp was taking hold of psychers and wreaking havoc on human colonies. Feudal night worlds were more conservative and less abiding of psychers, as we said previously, who had hunted them down. These would fare better than the others, who had adopted them more open-mindedly at the time. The knights in their semi-titan armor would battle massive warp entities and serve to protect the planet's human population, abiding to their strict code of feudal discipline and ability. Very often they would be the bastions that protected mankind's worlds, and their importance cannot be underestimated at this time. As is often the case in history, it is not one but a series of disasters that leads to total ruination, and this was no exception for the glorious empire humanity had established during the Dark Age of technology. Whilst it was struggling to recover from a collapse in its unity, as well as destruction of many of its resources and its ability to trade efficiently with other worlds, a new disaster would occur that would see the end of humanity's golden age and instead throw us further into near total annihilation. The race of man would never again reach this golden pinnacle of technological achievement. As we learned in ancient Eldar lore, it was at this time that the Eldar out in the galaxy would fall into near total destruction. These would be dark days indeed, as the Eldar were almost wiped out in a cataclysmic annihilation as the Chaos god Slaanesh was born into existence from the horrifically depraved mire that Eldar society had fallen into. This was a disaster for the Eldar, nearly extinguishing their light from the universe completely, but it didn't do humanity any favours either. The near destruction of the Eldar and birth of Slaanesh only came to mark the end of the Age of Strife. What caused it prior to these events was the ever-expanding sea of psychic energy known as the Warp. For many millennia, this had been growing more and more powerful, fueled by the nightmarish depravity that was Eldar society. Around the end of Millennium 24 and the beginning of 25, mankind was still struggling to recover from the disastrous war against its Men of Iron and its far-reaching impact on the previously secure and strong human federation. With their galactic unity destroyed, as well as suffering from the inevitable wounds of war, material shortages, mass loss of life and destruction of infrastructure, we would now face a new problem. Warp travel was becoming increasingly difficult. The warp's instability, caused in part by the Eldar's depraved psychic society, meant that many ships now would become lost and consumed by the warp as they were travelling through. This was not an issue for the Eldar themselves, as they used their webways to travel, which were outside of that warp space. For humanity, though, it would be a severe problem, and its impact would deal the fatal blow to an already fragile empire. The losses and damage caused by the war with the Men of Iron, combined with now being unable to travel across the warp to cross those great distances in the galaxy, would ultimately return humanity to a pre-Dark Age of technology state, where only sublight travel was possible. This was a disaster. Trade and support could no longer be conducted, as these journeys would now take generations to complete. Humanity was once again isolated as it had been millennia before. The warp storms and the isolation they would create would last for over 5,000 years, and their effect on human society across the galaxy was catastrophic. Some planets with a significantly advanced human colony would survive into the future if they had the means to defend and support themselves. It's important to understand that when a system is set up with no established backup, its collapse has an immediate and profound impact. This was the case with mankind's trade system. It had grown over time to enable many planets to survive solely on imports from other rich parts of the human federation. Without this infrastructure and no way to gain outside support, disaster was inevitable. Many would turn inwardly to the colony, consuming themselves from the inside out, first with barbaric civil war and later total anarchy, fighting over the scarce resources that remained. The final phase often led the significantly depleted population into a feudal system of warlords and barbarism. This chaos was repeated across the majority of human worlds in this period, even including Earth. At this time on Earth, large areas across the planet had become massive cities reaching for hundreds of miles, and having become adapted to a system where all activities were conducted by machines, Earth also now relied heavily on trade from colonized worlds to support the extremely high population count. Additionally, much of the planet was no longer capable of food production and hadn't been for millennia, hence the need for colonies and expansion in the first place. With the inability to travel and trade, Earth descended into a similar fate of the less advanced worlds. First panic and general disorder, then food riots, resource hoarding, and finally complete anarchy. A tribal warlord system was all that remained of the few survivors left on Earth, brutal warriors who battled out across the deserts and hives of the remnants of civilization. This whole situation might sound unbelievable that society could collapse so quickly and to such a severe degree, but it's worth considering that in this time human society had built itself up to be so strong in belief of its own invincibility that they simply did not and could not have anticipated the severity of the warp storms or how they would debilitate the trade and support systems that they had been relying upon. Human history is littered with examples of sheer arrogance outweighing logic and reason, as well as blindly staring down dangerous facts in favour of belief in our own self-importance. The lack of planning when it comes to losing their infrastructure across human systems was an acute example of human arrogance. It would now seem as well that whatever had protected human psyches from demonic possession would now end. It's my speculation that, as previously stated, the Emperor was what provided this shielding, even though he was not known to humanity at this time, for he knew the power, importance and value of human psyches in the dark times that would lie ahead. Without this bubble of protection that had invisibly existed prior to this time, humanity's weak psyches would be consumed, possessed, and go completely insane, causing chaos among isolated, colonized worlds. This period of complete anarchy would last for some 5,000 years, and during this time many colonies would forget their family out in the galaxy, as well as losing vast amounts of technology and knowledge. Only fragments of the glory of humanity would remain, preserved on the advanced worlds who were capable to survive this dark time. By the 28th millennium, almost all traces of civilization on Earth were gone. Instead, techno-barbarians battled one another over the scraps of the ancient human race. Mars, however, was one of the few worlds to undergo a different process. After a brief period of anarchy, the tech priests of the cult Mechanicus emerged victorious over the Psyker mutants, and then unified their homeworld. The priests visited Earth, but upon seeing its barren destruction, wrote it off as unsalvageable. They used any titans they had to help them in the future reunification of man. They would also be one of the few worlds to reach out and recolonize planets in this time. Using their knowledge of the warp, they chose moments of calm amid the storms of the time in the warp to travel through and establish new forge worlds. These were replicas of the tech homeworld of Mars and enabled them to continue support and recovery of the technology of man, as well as production of munitions and simpler war machines. But for humanity, its golden age was over. This dark age of technology had fallen apart catastrophically. Many of the weapons that once served mankind brought us to near destruction and turned lush garden worlds into irradiated deserts. Mechanical factory worlds into dystopian nightmares, beautifully advanced and artistic colonies turned into barbaric, nightmarish hells devoid of all morality. The age of strife was upon mankind, and only the further darkness of the future lay ahead. Roughly 5,000 years later, around the period of millennium 30 to 31, human society had reached a state of pitiful decay after cannibalizing itself for millennia. The Eldar had also reached the peak of their social decay, and so heralded the agonizing birth of the Chaos God Slaanesh, who would consume the majority of their population in one cataclysmic event that brought Eldar society to the brink of extinction. This horrific event, though, would have a positive outcome for mankind. It consumed all of that stored turbulent warp energy, so after thousands of years of instability, the warp returned to relative calm. Interstellar communication and travel would once again be possible for the civilization of mankind. So the age of strife was coming to an end, but before we move forward, we need to move back some 2,000 years to M28 to M30. Humanity had now come close to the brink of destruction itself. So many worlds had fallen into disarray, starvation, chaos, anarchy. Now was the time. This would be the time where the mysterious and powerful Psyker who had wandered amongst humanity for thousands of years would come to the fore to lead humanity from an edge of unsalvageable darkness back into the light and resume their place as a meaningful power in the galaxy. Earth had by now been reduced to a chemically irradiated barren wasteland, its population slaughtered, and all that remained were degenerate feral nomads fighting for irrelevant territories, insane wandering prophets, and cyber-augmented techno-barbarians who lived for nothing other than to fight, created in the cradle of world-ending war. Frail empires would rise and disintegrate as quickly and forgettably as they had risen. No tribe or faction had enough power or resources to make any meaningful stand, and so it went on, pathetic fighting over the remnants of a ravaged world. Out of this seemingly endless horror came a single man, a warlord like no other. His title in these early days is unknown, but we would know who he would rise to become: the Emperor of Man. He would first conquer and then rebuild humanity, leading it into the light, saving it from itself to form his autocracy, known as the Imperium of Mankind. Unlike so many before him though, he had power not only as an unstoppable warrior, but in many other traits such as rational thinking, tactics, philosophy, economics, compassion, foresight, and perhaps most importantly, a genius of science, everything and more that would be required for a supreme leader. The Emperor, though, fought not for selfish personal gain or bloodlust of war like all the other scattered remnants of humanity left on Earth. He had selfless, higher goals to restore humanity spiritually, intellectually, and physically, to revert us to a time of strength and prosperity. These were the years of the Unification Wars. The Emperor had long held a facility deep in a range of mountains previously known as the Himalayas. This was his most significant stronghold and would later become the Imperial Palace. Here he experimented with genetics as well as developing and constructing weapons and armor for his warriors. In the earliest days, he would physically and genetically augment some of the most powerful barbarians. These humanoids would become known as the Thunder Warriors. The very first of their kind and the most basic template for what would eventually become the Imperial Space Marines, the Astartes, the greatest warriors in the galaxy.